higher education institutions may have a lot to learn from vocational sector when it comes to recognition of prior learning. We had invited Jens Björnavold, a senior expert at Cedefop, to address us on this issue, and also to mention the European recommendation on validation of informal and formal learning. Unfortunately, Jens Björnavold couldn't make it here, but we have his colleague, Ernesto Villalba-Garcia, online. He's also an expert at Cedefop, so let us welcome Ernesto, hopefully. Welcome, Ernesto. The stage is yours.
Hello. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, of course.
Okay, I can. Okay. So good morning, everybody. Yeah, unfortunately, Jens couldn't make it. I would have loved to be in Sweden with you. But okay, I have to say that Jens is a super experienced, super excellent presenter, and I'm definitely not as good as he is, but I'll try my best. So I'm glad that I can be of some help. Yeah, exactly. So I will be presenting the European guidelines on validation that Cedefop has worked on. They are not exclusively on VET, let's say. They are not vocational education and training, but of course they are developed for all the educational sectors together, and also labor market and third sector. So it's really a comprehensive document for all validation practices in Europe, and trying to connect to the, let's say, to what the countries are supposed to do. But they have been developed within the context more of vocational education and training, also because we, together with the Commission, have done a lot of the work, and of course our expertise lies on VET. So I will present the guidelines first, a little bit of the background, then a little bit of the content of the guidelines, and then I will try to focus, let's say, on what is happening in higher education, on validation from the data we have from the European Inventory on Validation. Before I go into the guidelines specifically, I want to discuss a little bit of the concept of validation in a way. I think it's a rather simple concept in a sense. It's really the process of making something that is invisible visible. And this is the definition that the Council recommendation gives. And we say that it really has, it's a process, and it has 4 stages, let's say: identification, documentation, assessment, and certification. And we have been saying that this is quite important because it gives the flexibility to the concept, and it allows for a better connection with their national realities in a way. But of course, we are also discussing here recognition, and I think yesterday already that the guidelines were mentioned. There is always this discussion, let's say, on how recognition validation relates. Sometimes it is considered recognition like an extra step, let's say, where once you have gone through a validation of non-formal and informal learning, then there is a formal recognition from a formal educational institution. I have to say that there are other concepts: accreditation, prior learning assessment. So I still think that it's important that we are still not there, I think, in integrating all these concepts. And I think it's important, and I'm glad that I'm here actually, because in a way I think that this kind of conference can help us to bring these two together and to see how are we going to relate them to each other. And I think that from what I saw yesterday in the web streaming, it seems to me that you know, we are getting there. We have to have more opportunities like this, where people that are working in other sectors come and discuss about recognition, and we kind of try to get a comprehensive view on it. So the recommendation really, to me, is what has been given this backbone, let's say, for the validation of non-formal and informal learning and this connection with recognition in a way. And I want to talk a little bit of how we got to the recommendation. As I say, maybe it's too small there. I don't know how if you can see all of it, but I just go through this a little bit. The idea is that here you see the different years, different policy documents that talk about validation of non-formal and informal learning. And we have, in a recent paper, Jens and I have developed, we kind of talk about 3 stages in a way. The first one is before 2001, when all the policies on lifelong learning from the FREIR and these ideas of recurrent education were forming, let's say, and in 2001, you get the making an area of lifelong learning a reality from the Commission. And this really signals how lifelong learning becomes important, then all learning is included, let's say. And this triggers something with the Copenhagen Declaration also that has validation there, and non-formal and informal learning is an important step. It triggers more exchange and a lot of more connections between countries that are discussing these issues of validation more and more. In 2004, you have the common European principles that are specifically like a general idea, and they are really the basis for the guidelines that were developed in 2009, the first edition. And what I'm going to present is the 2015 edition, where we have tried to revise it in light of the recommendation. In between also, I think there was ECTS, it was also the ECVET recommendation, the EQF recommendation also had an important point, and I will try to bring all this together when I talk about the guidelines. But what I want to say is that in this period between 2001 and 2012, I think what we can see, especially in vocational education and training, is really that the field of validation kind of is expanding, and starting from VET, it goes into youth sector, higher education starts to talk about it, adult education also has some documents that relate to it. And from 2012, when the recommendation appears, validation of non-formal and informal learning becomes more of a broader policy aspect, or that is also connected to employment policies. And this, in the case of refugees, for example, now is becoming like an important part of social policies, let's say, in terms of integration and how to connect, let's say, people to the labor market. So something that started very much on VET, let's say, I think it has now expanded to other areas and to other policies in a way. From the recommendation, I also want to point out that there are 3 main issues, I would say. That one is that the EQF, the European Qualification Framework Advisory Group, is given the responsibility for the development of these recommendations. So now you have a group that you can share the information, and this is changed, this let's say, building up this conceptualization of validation across countries is becoming stronger. Then the recommendation also provides support and implementation. There's where Cedefop is mentioned, and that's why I'm here in a way, because we are working on this for a while. And it also asks for the updates of the guidelines and inventory. And this, I will talk about the guidelines more specifically, but this also is important because it kind of gives a political backup to the guidelines and the inventory. And it kind of made it more of a policy tool, let's say, that countries can use in a way to develop validation practices. So in 2009, we developed the first ones. It was a process of consultation from the 2004 when the principles come out to 2009. And then from 2012 to 2015, we developed the second version, the one that I will be presenting. The guidelines really are a document, as I say, for the countries to implement their validation arrangements. As you know, yesterday was mentioned, the recommendation asks member states by 2018 to have in place validation arrangements for the validation of non-formal and informal learning. And this really, what the document is trying to do is to tell the countries, okay, there are all these different areas that you need to look into, really, and ask yourself questions about how to implement these arrangements. So let's say it points out to areas that you have to kind of think about and the consequences that your actions might have. And they are really, we are trying very hard to make them work together with the European inventory. And I will talk a little bit about it at the end. The inventory really what it tries to do is to say, okay, we have all these different areas of worries, let's say, where you have to think about it. And then the inventory kind of shows how the member states and some other countries that we look into are actually implementing these areas, what is happening, let's say. I don't think I will have time to go into what is happening because, you know, I don't want to take too much time, but I will go into in each of these areas and try to give you an overview. So as I say, very important, there's no one single way of doing validation. In the recommendation, it says very clearly that this depends on each country. They are voluntary. I know that yesterday you were discussing about if the guidelines should be voluntary or kind of binding. These are clearly voluntary and they are really there to guide countries. They are not prescriptive. And I think this is important because, again, each context, and we are seeing this very clearly, is very, very different. So you need to create a general guidelines, let's say, and common denominators if you want, but you cannot impose because in each country will be a little different, which also means that sometimes it might be difficult to get this trust that you are talking about. But I think that the point is that if you are discussing these issues and you look at all these different areas and answer all these questions that we put in the guidelines in a way, we do believe that you are creating a trustable system. But I won't have much time to go into each of the questions, but I will try. I invite you to visit the guidelines, and we are always very happy to receive feedback. So this please do. So the first thing really that to me is the most important part, and we forget sometimes about it, is really the centrality of the individual. The guidelines really make very clearly that we are doing these validation processes, these validation arrangements for the individual, and it should be for him. And this means many things. Maybe it means that it might be a right, like it's in Norway and some other countries it's a right. But it also relates to the confidentiality, to the ownership of the results. So there are many questions that need to be answered, and I think that sometimes countries put in place very complicated validation arrangements that are not really focusing on what the individual needs. So I really think that we have to keep in mind that this is something that is done for the individual and not for our own sake. We have to create trustable systems, reliable assessment methods, but the individual has to be able to go through it. And there's no reason why this should be like this. The second point that I think also relates very much to this is that one has to take into account the objectives of the individual, in fact. The individual, when they go into a validation process, might want to obtain different things. They might want to get access to education, they might want to get a formal qualification, but they might just want to know what their competences are. And I think this is important to keep in mind. And I think the 4 stages of validation, in a way, are giving us this flexibility to see emphasis in each of these stages of validation will depend on what the individual wants. Because the individual will have to take the decisions at the end of the day. It is him who has to take, or her, who has to take the decisions. And so he might decide that he wants just to identify their competencies, learn what it is, this idea that they become more self-aware of who they are and what they can do. And then once they have this, they can go back to formal learning or to non-formal learning. And the upskilling pathways that now the Commission has put forward is really looking into this, tailored training programs for adults. No? He might go into some sort of accreditation, manage to document his skills and competencies, but he or he doesn't really manage to get to an formal assessment, or he might want to get a certificate, or he might want to get a formal qualification. And in each of those stages, you can always go back to learning in a way if you don't make it to where you are supposed to make it. No? So the individual really has to take informed decisions, and this is important. In higher education, in a way, we are narrowing it, the process, and we are narrowing it to get, let's say, a formal qualification or access or some kind of exceptions. So it is narrowing in a way the scope of validation of non-formal or recognition of prior learning, if you want, in higher education. So this makes things a little bit easier, I think. But as I say, what is important then is, and this is the third point, is that this individual has information guidance, and it has it all along the process, not only at the beginning, not only at the end, not only for the assessment, but that it really is an integrated guidance counseling system. And this really means that it has to be connected to other services, to public employment services, to counseling at university level and higher education, but also counseling in schools and in vocational schools. So it's really a matter of coordination across the stakeholders. And there are a lot of stakeholders. And this is one of the most difficult parts, I think, that we have when we deal with the validation of non-formal and informal learning. Because now, if we have all the contexts where you can actually learn everywhere, this means really that all these different people, all these different institutions are actually stakeholders in the process of validation. And this is why we have so much fragmented systems in a way. And this is where I think coordination is one of the challenges. Not only for the vet sector but for validation in general. And I think the national qualification frameworks, in a way, can help to kind of make all these stakeholders work together. I always say that the NQFs work as a lighthouse where, the individual is able to see the different where these different diplomas that he might be able to get are. And of course, if you work with NQFs, you need to work with the standards, and these have to be described in terms of learning outcomes, as you have already discussed yesterday. Sorry. I'm going very fast because I see my time is running out. I don't want to talk more than the 20 minutes. Then it's important that all this, of course, is handled with quality assurance. And this is something that we are seeing. Many countries don't have a specific quality assurance for validation, but they kind of use the general quality assurance. So this is something that we need to see further. Very connected to quality assurance is to have professional practitioners, especially counselors and assessors that are really well trained, and they are really professionalized in a way, so that we are able to train them and that they are prepared for developing this validation of non-formal and informal learning practices. And then we keep saying that also validation really works in the context, and it will be different if it's in education or if it's some validation processes, because again, identification, documentation, assessment happens also in the labor market, for example, when you are getting a job, when you are being interviewed in a company. So all these different things, we have studied some of them, are important. It's important to take into account where it's happening. Again, in higher education, it's very clear. In the educational sector, we see that most of the countries have validation arrangements in the education, of course. But we want to see how a lot of activities that are happening in the third sector, in the voluntary sector, also in companies with trade unions, with Chamber of Commerce, that are somehow connected to this education sector. And what we are seeing now is that it's all very fragmented. So, and then finally, another point that the guidelines make is that the validation tools have to be adaptable. There has to be different types of methods, and you can see there by countries which methods are most used, let's say. And you can see that a combination of methods is usually the best, and the portfolios is also the most used. And so it's important that we go into these different methods, and the guidelines in a way go through some of these methods and say how it works. But I have seen the practical guidelines for recognition that the European area of recognition manual, and I think they are much more detailed on these tools and these kind of micro level information. So this, again, we need to see how we can combine all this. So all these 10 different parts that I have talked really can be summarized in two. And one is really that all learning is, irrespective of where it is important, and this is a fundamental value that validation has to bring in, and the fact that non-formal and informal learning has to be, in a way, supplemented and has to kind of be combined with formal learning. So if I have 5 more minutes, I'm going to tell you about the European inventory also. This is, as I say, where we collect information on the different countries and what has happened, and kind of tries to mirror the guidelines. And I just want to point out that on higher education, we have seen that in 27 countries, there are possibilities for validation. Out of the 36 that we look into, there are possibilities in 27 countries for the validation of non-formal and informal learning at the higher level of education. So this is quite a lot. And also I want to show, this is for all educational sectors, is that there are many different things that you can obtain, and there are quite a lot of countries doing a lot. In 25 countries you can get access to formal education, you can get exceptions, you can get certificates that are not necessarily to formal education, or you can get an award of a full or a part of a qualification. And this, again, is in almost all, a lot of the countries, let's say in 30 countries out of 36 that we look into, you can actually have some parts of your qualification awarded through validation. So the processes are there, but as I say, these are not necessarily spread all over all of educational sectors, as you can see in that first slide that I saw. We still have very limited data on what is really happening and how many people are going through it. And the information we have is, in general, the numbers are still limited, so it's not a reality. We don't, because we don't have the data, we don't know much about the impact. And this is important to kind of advocate for it. And as I have been saying, there is little connection with other activities that are going outside formal education, like things that voluntary sector does, or the youth sector, or even the labor market does. So this is something that we really need to work. So in terms of the challenges for the future, I think that I see from higher education that are very similar, I think, to what we see in vocational education and training, is really, the first one is really the coordination and connection to other aspects, to other arrangements. We see a very fragmented picture on validation, and I think that we need to work on the coherence of all these different approaches. So the individual, again, that is the one that is supposed to be at the center, doesn't get lost in all these procedures. For this, you need information, guidance, and counseling, and this means really that, again, you have a process that is integrated, that is coordinated with other things, and that the person that is in the public employment service getting some sort of validation can also go to university and kind of use this thing that he has done in the public employment services to go into the higher education, for example. For these also, the standards and the learning outcomes, I think you have been discussing it yesterday, it's important that things are in terms of learning outcomes. If we don't have learning outcomes, so what the person is able to do and know when they finish their education, is very difficult to kind of make sure that this person has achieved what he's supposed to achieve. And the fourth and very important challenge, in a way, I see, is that we see that the structures are in place, the legislation is in place in a lot of the countries, but now we need to put resources, we need the financing, we need the people, we need the practitioners that are really there and well trained to do it. And this is, I think, our next step, and I think this coordination among stakeholders will really help, I believe, in this real implementation. So with that, I thank you very much. I hope I didn't go too much into over my time. It's difficult to see from here if I should stop or not, or how fast I'm going. Everything is in our webpage. Also, I'm eager Twitter, and I'm learning a lot there. So also, please go. You can get some information out from there. And as I said, for us, the guidelines is a document that really wants to be alive, and we are always happy to receive feedback and comments or criticism on how we can be improved, what doesn't work, what works, because the point of the guidelines is really for people to use them and to kind of hopefully create kind of an understanding of the concept, and that we all are talking the same language. So thank you very much for your attention, and I don't know if I can take some questions. I'll try to see from here I can hear.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. I don't know if you could hear it, but we thank you with a warm applause. We do not have time for questions now, but maybe they can email you the questions afterwards or something like that. And we will also send you a token of gratitude. It's a book with Swedish food culture and Swedish recipes. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.